Well, I would like to welcome you all to our Pertev Naili Boratav lecture series on folklore and oral history. We inaugurated this lecture series with my folklore friends and colleagues Hande Birkanan, Mücahit Demirer, Fahriye Dinçer, and Meltem Türköz in 2008, first as a memorial panel for the 10th anniversary of Pertev Hoca's loss on March 16, 1998. Since then, we try to invite folklore scholars to Boğaziçi University every 2 years to share their journey in the field of folklore or their recent work. We had the pleasure of hosting Hasan El-Shami in 2010, Margaret Mills in 2012, Richard Bauman and Beverly Stalter in 2014, and Laurence Fournier in 2016. We had to cancel our 2018 talk at the last minute. It was an unfortunate event. And March 2020 was the start of the pandemic, so we couldn't organize to do it in a kind of a Zoom meeting back then. After a break of 4 years, it is our pleasure to host today the lecture series, and our friend, Professor Lisa Gilman, kindly accepted in the last minute, with a very short minute. So I'm grateful to her for her kindness. Pertev Boratav's legacy continues to shed light on us with his scholarship and his life story. His international contribution has not yet been fully explored. Laurence Fournier, the last speaker of our series, gave a wonderful talk on Pertev Hoca's being discovered by the curators of the Musée des Traditions Populaires in Paris during the 1950s, when the section on traditional French games were being classified and exhibited. This article is available in Turkish under Toplumsal Tarih for those of you who are interested, but I believe there is a kind of a domain of international recognition that Boratav deserves, and we have to kind of develop some projects in that regard, along with his archive and its visibility. I will now give the word to my dear friend and colleague Meltem Türköz to introduce Lisa Gilman before her talk. But let me also remind that Pertev Boratav has been one of the earliest Turkish contributors to JAF, Journal of American Folklore, now edited by Lisa, with an essay on Ottoman African folklore, and Africa being also a well-known domain to Lisa. I thank you all for being here, and I would like to particularly salute the members of the Boratav family who have been a great support to our lecture series since the beginning. I also salute my friends from the ICTM Turkey Circle, the International Council for Traditional Music, which extends its vision to all domains of folklore, including verbal art as performance and material culture. I would like to thank also my colleagues, Professor Selçuk Esenbel, Meltem Türköz, and Zeynep Oktay in the preparation of this lecture series for this year. And of course, last but not least, Batuhan Özbelli, our dear assistant, who helped us to actually realize this talk today. I would like to also salute my colleagues from Boğaziçi University and my students from Boğaziçi University who also joined us along with all the participants from outside of Turkey. You are all welcome to this interesting talk. And I give the word to Meltem. Meltem, the word is yours.
Thank you. Well, I get to introduce you, Lisa. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lisa Gilman, who is a professor in folklore studies and public humanities at George Mason University's English department. She is also the editor of the Journal of American Folklore. Her research interests include performance, music, dance, intangible cultural heritage, trauma, gender, and sexuality in Southern Africa and the United States. And of course, we can also include Turkey in there, since Lisa is actively involved in field research in Istanbul. Lisa is very prolific, mashallah. Her monographs include Folklore and Ethnomusicology Fieldwork Methods Handbook with John Fenn. And then the next one, My Music, My War, The Listening Habits of US Troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Lisa did field work among military personnel who had been in, who were in war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think it's very interesting, the types of music that they listen to when they're in war. The next one is The Dance of Politics, Performance, Gender, and Democratization in Malawi. She co-edited volumes, one of them called UNESCO on the Ground, Local Perspectives on Intangible Cultural Heritage with Michael Dillon Foster. And also Africa Every Day, Fun, Leisure, and Expressive Culture on the African Continent. Lisa, as a folklorist, Lisa does not also produce written work. She's also a filmmaker, and she has a documentary film called Grounds for Resistance about the anti-war activism of US veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And at George Mason University, she teaches courses in folklore, public humanities, ethnographic field work, digital storytelling, gender and sexuality, and African studies. And Lisa has said that she's interested in developing how to produce research products that are beyond the typical academic output. So she produces and she encourages her students to produce documentary. She trains her students in digital storytelling and also teaches teaching ethnographic methods in field schools as part of this objective. And she's currently doing field research on refugee-led art initiatives. One of them is in Turkey. I'm aware of Malawi and France and South Africa. And the last bit of information that I want to add is Lisa has had a very sort of international upbringing, born in Congo, in the Republic of Congo, right, Lisa?
The Democratic Republic of Congo.
Democratic Republic of Congo, and following her parents who were sociologists and Peace Corps volunteers to many other destinations, including, can you just tell us a few of them?
Where I lived?
Yeah.
Well, I lived in the Congo and then in England when I was little, and then in various parts of the US, but then my parents continued living all across the world. So kind of had a very kind of global perspective in my upbringing.
Yeah. And it was, I could see that in the way that you interact with Istanbul. You just come in and find your way. So with that being said, I leave you with Professor Lisa Gilman. We look forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Miltem, for that wonderful intro. And thank you, Arzu, for inviting me. Thank you, Selçuk, for hosting this. It's so nice. I told Arzu this morning, I feel like I have a separate whole life in Istanbul now, and where I have my friends and my social life, and now developing colleagues. So I think it's something that I really cherish, and I'm looking forward to expanding as the years come on. And thank you all of you for coming. It's nice to see folks from ICTM, some people that I've just recently met, people that I've known a little bit longer, and people that I don't know. So hopefully I will, as I said, I'm looking forward to the conversation today, but also just expanding relationships and networks, which is really what folklore is all about and what academia is all about. So the only way I can do all the work that I do is because I've had the great fortune to be connected to so many people in different locations. So I'm really honored to be here today, and really appreciate and respect your invitation and your showing up. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint so that I don't just talk all over the place. So just give me a moment. Okay. It's amazing that 2 years ago we didn't know how to do this, but now I know how to see my screen and all of you. And I'm going to, I'm going to talk, and then we'll have time for questions after, but also feel free to use the chat. And if I can, if those of you who are not talking can keep track of the chat and just jump in and interrupt me if at any point it makes sense for me to stop and address something. Otherwise, I'll talk a little bit. During the Q&A, we'll see what's in the chat. So my presentation today is called Performance, Power, and Publics: One Person's Path Through the Changing Field of Folklore. And what Arzu asked me to do today is to talk a little bit about some of the big shifts that have happened in folklore studies since the time that that I became a folklorist, since the time that Arzu, Meltem, and I, some of us are all of a similar generation. There have been some pretty huge transformations in both the study of folklore, but also just professional folklore more broadly, both in academia and outside. So what she asked me to do, if I understood, was to talk about some of these shifts specifically through the narrative of my own professional trajectory. So I know Meltem just kind of gave you a rundown of some of the work that I've done. I'm going to do a similar thing, but I will anchor different projects that I've done in relationship to some of the big shifts that have happened. So I will start very briefly by telling you a little bit about who I am. And then I'll talk about these developments in US folkloristics, focusing on the shift to performance studies, digital technological transformations that have completely transformed all of our lives and all of our disciplines, but very much so the field of folklore. The dissolving of this big tension between academic folklorists and public folklorists, and then an orientation towards collaboration and advocacy. So to begin with, who am I? So Meltem already told you this. I'm a professor of folklore at George Mason University. I'm the editor of the Journal of American Folklore. My research interests, a few of them, African studies, intangible cultural heritage, music and war, gender and sexuality, public folklore, arts and refugees. I should add that in my PowerPoint today, I use the word folklore because I'm giving a folklore talk, but I should say that I just as much am very much involved with ethnomusicology, because my research somehow has always focused on genres of music and dance. So I find that my colleagues in ethnomusicology we tend to be sometimes more closely aligned than some of my colleagues in folklore. But certainly I'm a participant in both worlds. I've published a lot in music venues. Also, because I'm in African studies, ethnomusicology is much more, US ethnomusicology is much more developed in terms of African ethnomusicology than folklore. So I have more colleagues in ethnomusicology who are working in African context than I do in US folklore. So my work is both branches into music in a lot of different ways for those of you who are coming from ICTM or otherwise involved in the world of music studies. So how did I become a folklorist? Every folklorist has their tale, so I'm going to tell you mine in brief. So yes, I was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that is absolutely fundamental to my story. I tried to find a baby picture for you, but I couldn't quite get that together in such short notice. Sorry for that. My parents were professors. It was the late 60s. African countries were just obtaining independence. It was a very exciting time. There was a lot of hope and dreams for building the independent countries. My father had been in one of the first waves that went to the Peace Corps. He went to Cameroon. And so my parents' presence in the Congo was very ideologically based, in that they were there not to be kind of the white people there to impose their vision on the local population. They were there to work with their Congolese colleagues to educate the next generation of leaders and educators and intellectuals. So I had a very it was a very immersive, integrated experience. So I was the only white kid in my school. I spoke multiple languages. I was very immersed in the local culture, which is kind of, as Meltem was saying, I feel very comfortable being a foreigner somewhere, sometimes more than I feel comfortable being an American in the US, because that's not as comfortable to me as kind of being the cool foreigner who knows how to be in a place, maybe, or that's how I'd like to think of myself. So when I was 9, we moved to the US, but we maintained really strong connections to the DRC. But I never went back to Africa during that time. And for those of you who know anything about the DRC, it has been just a really fraught place politically since the time. It always has, because they have an incredible amount of wealth and natural resources. And so there's been just ongoing war and conflict and exploitation by European powers. And so I grew up in an environment where there was war going on and conflict and corruption, and it was very present. But as a kid, what I remember is dancing and playing with my friends and eating really delicious foods and telling jokes and, just kind of the real lively part of what life is. And so I was kind of had this experience as a child of being very aware of politics at a very young age. At the same time, I was very aware that there can be terrible things happening in the world, and people are still falling in love and dancing and participating in traditions and all of this. So this tension between kind of political ick and violence and drama and really bad stuff, and kind of joy and pleasure and life and connection and community is really at the center of all of my work. And who knew that I would establish that when I was 4 or something. So it's kind of crazy to think about the roots of how we become who we are. So when I went to college, by the time I was in high school, I was in Tennessee. For those of you who know the US, that was an unusual place for me to end up. And then I went to college at the University of Oregon and majored in political science again, because I cared about the politics. And so I was very active, became an activist. I cared a lot about trying to make the world a better place. I was 18 and thought I had that power. I don't. So then in the summer after my sophomore year, I had the opportunity to go to Senegal. And I spent the summer in Senegal, and it just completely put everything on its head. It was my first time back on the African continent. And so it was very emotional for me. And I just kind of fell in love and didn't want to leave. And my whole brain kind of was scrambled for a little bit. And so that was a very intense experience. And then when I came back to the University of Oregon, I had to take gen ed requirements, and I had to take some things in the humanities. And so folklore sounded kind of interesting. Folk tales are cool. I like to read. So I took my first folklore class with Professor Sharon Sherman. And I had this like, aha, I get it. I don't want to be a political scientist. I want to be a folklorist, because what I'm more interested in is how people on the ground experience politics and respond to politics than wanting to study the political structures that be. So, it was like being in Senegal and then coming back and just happening to take this class was really transformative. And I realized I love the arts and food and tradition and clothing, fashion, all that stuff, as a way to study politics just seemed like, that was it. Of course, I told my parents I wanted to be a folklorist, and despite the fact that they were very unconventional, my father said, "How are you going to get a job? This is not a good choice." And I said, "Well, Dad, you never taught me that I should follow a path that would lead to a job, so I'm going to do this anyway." So I went to Indiana University, which for those of you in the world of folklore, it's a really internationally renowned institution. And it has both folklore and ethnomusicology are in the same department. I didn't know I was going to do anything with ethnomusicology, but that happened to be the context. It also has one of the strongest African studies programs in the country. And so it was a really good fit for me. So I got a master's in folklore and then a PhD in folklore with a minor in African studies. And I put up some of my professors and mentors up here. And some of them, Dick and Beverly, are also mentors to Arzu, and I think Beverly to Meltem to some degree. And I have both ethnomusicologists and folklore. So Tui is an ethnomusicologist who works in China. Ruth Stone is a ethnomusicologist who works in Liberia and West Africa. Beverly Stolce is a folklorist who works in Ghana as well in the US, and Dick Bauman is a folklorist who's known for kind of really shaping performance studies in the field. So I was trained very much within this world of performance studies a la Indiana University. So what is performance studies? So in folklore studies, and this is just a nutshell explanation, is prior to the 60s and 70s and 80s, a lot of folklore studies was really oriented towards texts. Folklorists collected texts, they categorized texts, they analyzed texts, and their kind of analytical questions that they brought in were very oriented towards this kind of this kind of fixed thing that was an item of folklore that could be analyzed in and of itself. With the shift to performance studies came this recognition that texts don't have meaning on their own. That if you take something like a story that is part of oral tradition, you can look at that story and you can analyze it all sorts of different ways, but how you analyze it as the scholar is not going to be the same as the way that that story works in a social environment. Context is absolutely critical for understanding what stories do in the world. You have to know who's telling the story, why they're telling the story, who they're telling the story to, what is the environment, are they telling it in a house or on a stage or in a lecture room or at a festival? Is somebody paying for this to be told? What is the larger political or social or economic context in which the storytelling happens? You need all of that context to really understand not how the scholar analyzes the story, but how the people who are engaged with the story are using the story, what it means for them, what kinds of significance it has. So I'm using story as an example, but the same goes for if you're thinking about pottery or how somebody organizes a festival, a particular holiday or celebration or festival, or thinking about recipes and food, or material culture, quilts and pottery and all sorts of different things. So this context is really important, as well as process. So related to context is process. That the story doesn't just happen. There's a process through which it is learned, through which it's passed on, through which it's adapted and changes each time it is told in relationship to the new context in which it is told. So the shift to performance studies really emphasizes the social dimension of folklore, right? So it's not, it's really kind of how it exists in social contexts. Folklorists ask, how are folklore forms used and what do they mean? So this was, for me, as somebody who was interested in politics and how people on the ground experience and interact and respond to politics, the performance approach was perfect, right? It's a more sociological approach to thinking about the arts. And my work has always been very, very transdisciplinary. I would say not even interdisciplinary, it's transdisciplinary. I'm interested in particular questions that have to do with the social, the political, the economic, and I use the arts as a way to explore those questions. So that's kind of my kind of positioning within performance studies. So for my PhD project, I went to Malawi. So again, after going to Senegal, I knew I wanted to do research in an African context. The Congo was not someplace I wanted to go because there's so much, there's a lot of conflict. It's a difficult place to go to and be in. I had the opportunity to go to Malawi, and the year that I went to Malawi first was in 1995. And Malawi became independent. The British colonized the region, named it Malawi. And in 1964, it became independent. And very quickly, the person who had been elected president, Dr. Hastings Kamuzubanda, imposed a dictatorial system of government. And so there was a dictatorship up until 1994. And 1992, they'd had an election to have multi-party elections. There was a transition to multi-party politics. And I went in 1995, so 1 year after that transition to multi-party politics. So with my interest in politics, it was a really interesting time to go. And I took out some pictures here that there was a picture in my slide that showed during during the dictatorship, he very actively used dance, specifically women's dancing, as a way to legitimate and consolidate power. So he would have these massive events where thousands and thousands and thousands of women would come dressed in outfits head to toe that had pictures of his face on them. And they would sing and dance and sing songs about how wonderful he was as a leader. And that was just part of the political culture. It was just part of the fabric of everyday life, was these images and the sounds and the movement of women dancing his praises. So when I came in 1995, it was a very interesting time to find out what would happen with women in politics in that transition moment. So when I went, I originally thought I would study women and dance in politics with a little p. I was more interested in power dynamics, how women use music and dance to gain power and agency in their everyday lives. And here you can see some images from my fieldwork of going around to any opportunity where there was dance. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the project I landed on. So first of all, I realized most people don't know where Malawi is. So Malawi is this teeny country in southeastern Africa. It's utterly gorgeous. It's a really wonderful place to visit. I recommend anybody go visit who's interested. Here is a larger image of the country. 2/3 of the country has a lake. So it's kind of like there's a lot of coastal line, a lot of fishing, a lot of agriculture. And I did a lot of my research in this town of Nkata Bay, which is in the northern district, but I've also lived now in the southern district, and I've lived throughout the country over the years. So I'm going to tell you briefly about this project as a way to talk about performance studies. Again, I'm trying to anchor the moments in kind of folklore political history with my research, so bear with me. So my research into dance and politics was during this early phase of multi-partyism, where we went from the dictatorship to having a lot of different parties. So now the country is developing a culture around campaigns, like having election campaigns and each politician having to go around and do political rallies and try to gain membership. So what happened, and this is just kind of in a nutshell, is that with the shift to multi-partyism, is that different political parties adapted the practice that had been happening during the dictatorship to have women dance for them politically, but now you have each individual political party. So each political party developed a symbol, acronym, they created fabric with the acronym of the party. No faces at this point. We're not doing politicians' faces anymore. And then at every political rally, you would have this throng of women who would show up in the party fabric and who would sing songs praising the political party and the political candidate that was for that rally, as well as the presidential candidate for the party. So this image I'm showing you is from the elections that took place in 1999. So this was the second multi-party election ever. And here we are at the Mzuzu airport. So the Mzuzu is a small city in the north. And the president of the country at the time, Bakili Muluzi of the United Democratic Front Party, is going to come to Mzuzu for a big campaign rally for his election, hoping to be re-elected president. And the North does not support Muluzi. It's not, at that time, the North supported a different political party, the Alliance for Democracy, called Ford. So the political party had to work really hard to create an image that Muluzi had support And so they distributed yellow cloth everywhere, and they organized a lot of women to dance for him. So here we are waiting for hours at this airport on the hot tarmac, waiting for Muluzi to show up. And if we had more time, I'd show you the footage of the airplane showing up and Muluzi arriving and walking down the red carpet while the women sing how wonderful he is. The next day, he had his political rally. So here is the president wearing his signature yellow color, and he's giving his speech. Vote for me, I'm fantastic. While he does that, there's women seated in the middle of the arena. There's the audience is in back, and there's women sitting in the middle wearing his fabric. And when he says something amazing, they jump up and they say, yes, Muluzi, you're fantastic. We will vote for you. You have changed the country. You're wonderful. And then at the end of the speeches, the party organizers organize a lot of different dance groups to dance. A lot of them are women wearing yellow fabric, again, singing how wonderful Muluzi is and how wonderful the party is. So this practice has continued. So I wrote a book about that, and I'll show you kind of the conclusions, but I just want, I've been following this practice, and for a brief minute, Malawi had a women president. They beat the US. They've gotten a woman president way before we ever will. So in 2012 to 2013, Joyce Banda became the president. And lo and behold, even when you have a woman president, you have the women dancing, and a very important part of the political culture. And here you can see on the fabric, her party is, their signature color is orange, obviously, the People's Progressive Party, and now the fabric has her face on it. So we've come back full circle. Now all the parties have faces on the fabric again. That's a whole other story I won't get into today. So the conclusions from this project, again, me taking this kind of performance studies approach to studying dance, right, a form of music, is I used music and dance and women's participation as my entry point into analyzing women's positioning within social and political structures. And I also used it to really tackle the topic of how the arts interplays with politics. Like this music and dance, it's used as a way, structurally, the women who dance are poor women who don't have a lot of political opportunities. So my argument is this system kind of keeps these women at this lower hierarchy. So you have this intersection of gender and class in the political system. But I also make the argument that they are vital and absolutely necessary to the political process. As people told me over and over, nobody will come to a political rally if there's not music and dance. Listening to people talk is boring. And they play a very important role in terms of spreading symbols and messages, making it look like a party has support, reifying the party in people's minds that it really exists, because you see real bodies with fabric singing that this party must happen. So this project is really grounded in performance studies, is also very much informed by other things that are happening in our intellectual sphere at the time, and that continue to be important now. So feminist theory for sure. Also this idea of intersectionality, recognizing that each of us is positioned in various axes of social hierarchies. So we can't just think of women from a gender perspective. We have to recognize that women all in the Malawian context, that their class positioning also impacts, intersects with their gender and impacts what their opportunities are within politics, or what kind of agency they can have, or what kind of contributions they can have. The other very important thing that was also a big transformation in the 60s and 70s is this importance of attending to positionality of the researcher, is that recognizing that, as a researcher, I don't just come in with this objective eye and analyze and study what's going on, but I'm a human being with my own social positioning. So when I come from the US, I am a European, which is, I'm part of the kind of post-colonial, neo-colonial system. I'm automatically given privilege and access to spaces and people and resources that other people don't. I'm a feminist, so I'm coming in with my own perspective and my own biases. And so who I am impacts what research I can do, who I can interact with, what people will tell me, what they'll give me access to, and also my analyses and my outputs. So those are also big transformations that happened before I came on the scene, but that have continued to be very, very important. And I see Margaret Mills here, who of course has been really instrumental in making these changes happen. So I'm delighted that you are here and honored that you are here. So I'm going to now shift to another big transformation. So that was my attempt to kind of tackle the performance studies piece of it. And now I'm going to move on to talk about technological developments. So I used the Google, my favorite teaching tool, because you can get images of everything, to put together this slide to try to throw out there how much technology has changed everything, right? So we've just had a seismic shift in how people communicate, how people form community, how people engage with the arts, with one another, with politics. So, that's all been blowing up, really came to a head as I was starting to teach. So some of the things that this big technological transformation has really raised questions within the field of folklore. And that, like when I was being trained, we really emphasized folklore as being what happens face to face. Like one of the things that's different about folklore than, say, popular culture is that it's not mediated through technology. This is when we're hanging out together with other people, chit-chatting and dancing together and cooking together, eating together. This is what folklore is. So, as I was, got my first I had several jobs before Oregon. Oregon was my first one that was a bona fide folklore position. I remember arguing with my colleagues because my students wanted to do projects that were online projects, and my colleagues were like, that's not folklore. And I was saying, well, I think it is. I think that we're just changing how we communicate and how we interact. And, I think our students are onto something. And so I kind of got there, as kind of the younger person, but also older than than my students. So kind of like in this kind of inter period. Also, the question of how long does something have to exist to be folklore? We used to talk about multi-generational stuff, or I don't know, at least that should exist for several years. But can we count something as folklore that's very ephemeral, that's just kind of happening and quickly dissipating? And can you do ethnographic fieldwork remotely? There's many, many more questions, but these are just three that I'm going to talk about today, specifically in thinking about my own work. So to talk about technological developments, I'm going to talk about the next big project. It overlapped with my Dance in Malawi project, but this was a US-based project that I did, and Meltem mentioned this. And I started this in, let's see, I don't remember years anymore. I'm like, how old are my kids? It was like 2003 or something. And we, at the time, the US had recently, 9/11 had happened, my very first semester teaching, my first semester at my first real job. And at that time, I was getting some criticism for my work in Malawi. It's like, what are you doing, white feminist lady, critiquing Malawian politics, which is a legit question. And so I was like, well, maybe I should do a project at home. I need to look at what's going on politically at home and kind of shift my focus a little bit and use some of the same ideas and questions and interests that I have to see what's going on at home. And at the time, we had invaded two countries. We were involved in these two wars, and academics were really not talking about it. And we really were not. And there was also very little discourse in the country about the people who were on the ground fighting the wars. There was a lot about we don't like the wars, or we like the wars, or terrorism and all this kind of stuff. But I was thinking, like, what about the people who have to actually go and be on the ground and do this stuff? Like, what are they doing? What are they thinking? And this goes back to my childhood. When I went to high school in Tennessee, I lived in Clarksville, Tennessee, which is right next to the Fort Campbell Army base. So all my friends were the children of people in the military, and the majority of my friends went into the military. I went as far away as I could to Oregon to go to college. My friends went into the military. I knew they went into the military because they needed jobs, and that was just the trajectory that was available to them. So I had this kind of like awareness that a lot of the people who were fighting the wars were not the people making the decision to invade, right? They're just like these young people who just kind of joined the military for whatever reason. And so I was really interested in trying to tell the story of the people who are fighting the war, to try to figure out what they're thinking, what they're doing, what the impacts are on them. And I wanted to do it apolitically. I didn't, what we were hearing about the troops is either they were like these patriotic people serving the country, or that they were vulnerable victims. And I wanted to get out of that. I wanted to really just talk about human beings. So, you know, obviously it took me a while to land on this, but eventually what I got to was, I used, this project, like the Malawian one, it seems completely different, but the relationship is, in both cases, I'm using the arts to try to see how people on the ground experience and respond to politics, and again, the role of the arts in the social and political world. So the focus of this project ended up being about musical listening. After some trial and error, what I found out is that troops in these wars literally were listening to music constantly, and the big transformations in musical listening right when these wars started was the development of accessible and cheap individual listening devices with the MP3 format. So suddenly troops could have these tiny little devices and have tons of music. They could acquire new music, they could trade music. And so there was this massive transformation in how people access music, but also how people listen to music. Because with MP3 players, you can curate your own listening and have one song and then another song and another song, versus listening to kind of CDs. And anyway, that I won't go into it, but it was, you know, kind of a revolutionary shift in music. And so what I found out is that people at war are listening to music constantly, which I would never have guessed. And so I devised a project where basically I interviewed people and I asked them questions about music. And a lot of people were like, if you had asked me what was it like at war, I would never have talked to you. But when you asked me about music, I was willing to talk about music. And so I used music as a way to talk about what it's like to be at war, to talk about emotion, to talk about masculinity, music and memory, music and trauma, music and joy. Like people have fun at war, like here they're making a video, you know, they're hanging out, they're developing friendships, creating community. There's conflict around race, around gender, around religion, around sexuality. So by using music, I was able to put together a really, you know, tease out a lot of really nuanced information about the experience of war. So with this, I wrote a book, wrote some articles, but then I also did ethnographic research with a group of veterans who were involved in the anti-war effort. And at that time, it was very invisible. We didn't know that veterans were anti-war. We didn't know that there was a movement of veterans who were, you know, who had been to war themselves and came back and were like, oh, what did I do? What was that? I don't like that. And they were very active, but it wasn't part of it wasn't very visible in the media or in storytelling anywhere. So I made a documentary film about that, which is the film Grounds to Resistance, which is available online now on YouTube for free if anybody wants to watch it. Okay, so I'm taking a lot of time, so I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker with this. So another big shift is that when I was coming up in the folklore world, there was this big rift between academic folklorists and public folklorists. Academic folklorists being the ones who teach in universities and give lectures and whatnot, the public folklorists being the ones that were working in museums or state arts agencies, who were organizing festivals, working with communities to document them, working in K-12 education. And the tension was complicated, but there was a perception that academic folklorists were superior. Those of us who weren't working in academia, it was because they had failed to get an academic job, was a lot of the discourse and rhetoric and ideas, just wrong. Meanwhile, public folklorists, as far as I was concerned, were doing some of the most innovative and most impactful work. And we had the situation where universities were largely training folklorists to be them, you know, professors knew academia, so they were teaching folklorists to be academics, but a lot of folklorists were graduating to work in the public sector. and we weren't doing a good job of training our students to do that. So some of my contributions to public sector folklore have been, as a professor, is developing public sector training in the universities I've been a part of, a public sector track at the University of Oregon, bringing the state folklife agency in Oregon to campus. And now I'm at George Mason University, which is in the DC area. So it's really fun because I'm collaborating with national organizations like the American Folklife Center, the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, also state agencies, county agencies, to provide hands-on practical opportunities for students both in the classroom and outside, so that when they graduate, they have a real, some real skills that are marketable outside of academia. My scholarship, I would say, has always been publicly engaged. The kinds of questions I ask are about social justice, social inequities, how to address those, bringing visibility to issues or people. So I feel like, you know, the work I do has these very publicly engaged rather than more kind of cerebral intellectual questions. They are intellectual questions, but they're publicly engaged intellectual questions. I've also done some public scholarship. So I have a documentary film that's very oriented towards, you know, not an academic audience. I've collaborated on this. This is just one example of this amazing project that I did collaboratively through the Oregon Folklife Network with students and University of Oregon staff. With these are men who are in a prison in Oregon who are involved in a crochet group. So they're all in prison for having done really terrible things, but they're also human beings who are working, have done a lot of personal transformation. And they spend hours and hours each week crocheting soft, cuddly, beautiful things to give to children and victims of domestic violence and other people who have been harmed by the kinds of crimes that a lot of people in prison do. It's part of this restorative justice movement. So we did research in the prison with these men, and then we did an exhibit. We created an online exhibit. We brought the exhibit to the men because they are stuck in prison. They couldn't go see it. So we brought it back, documented it for them so they could see people interacting with them as positive human beings rather than just kind of being pinpointed as based on a crime that they did a long, long time ago. So these are some beautiful images that we took for the exhibit. And then just briefly, my fieldwork textbook that I co-wrote with John Fenn is really attempting to address things like positionality, ethics, public and academic folklore, diversity, trying to technological developments, doing work inside and outside, or using face-to-face and digital technologies, etc. All right, I'm just going to take a few minutes now to talk about my current project. And I'll use this as a way to say that, you know, while I've been talking about these different things, they also all come together. And for me, this project really brings together my interest in arts and politics, performance studies approach, digital fieldwork, digital folklore, academic and public divide, and attention to intersectionality and many other things. Oops, wrong arrow. So this new project is on refugee and the arts. It was inspired by both something I knew about in Malawi and then by my 2019 visit to Istanbul when I was a visiting lecturer at Boğaziçi. And I became really interested in the fact that, again, we have, you know, what's going on in the world, refugee crisis, refugee crisis, refugee crisis. Right now, we have 4 million people that have just left Ukraine. A few months ago, it was, you know, all the people leaving Afghanistan. Every country seems to have a refugee crisis. The world is refugee crisis. And once again, I'm like, who are the people? What's going, you know, the word refugee, 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 like, who are these human beings and what, you know, we hear a lot of negative stories about them as vulnerable, as victims, or as coming to having nefarious objectives or draining the economy or taking our jobs. And so I wanted to figure out a way to do a project that thinks globally about migrants and the people who are forced to leave their home, but that focuses on a positive story. things that they're doing as they're moving for themselves and for other people, because I think that's really missing a lot from the discourse that we hear. So that's just kind of in a nutshell. The project is bigger than that. But right now, kind of in a simple form, my idea is a book, and each chapter is going to be set in a different country and is going to focus on an initiative in that country that was started by refugees or migrants using arts to do something for themselves and for other refugees or migrants. So in November of 2021, I was finally able to travel again. I put this project on hold because of COVID. And I went to Malawi for this incredible festival that happens. And I stayed, I was able to stay in the refugee camp of Dzaleka refugee camp that has something like 50,000 refugees. It was built for like 6,000. And I stayed with this family. They all have different last names, so I won't use the last name, but they're from Burundi. The parents left 27 years ago and have been refugees ever since. They've had 12 children. Their children are all born as refugees. And so unless they are resettled, they are as refugees, they are really, really restricted in terms of their human rights, their mobility, etc. And in my conversation with the mother, Catherine Zeimana, she said Tonsitiliantu at some point, which is we are all people. And I kept hearing that phrase over and over and over. And the fact that she felt like she needed to say that, and people need to say that, speaks to the idea that, and I heard this in Turkey when I was just there as well, is that a lot of refugees feel like they have become refugees. They're no longer human beings. And as refugees, they are treated as and considered less than in many ways, both in terms of the legal system, but also in terms of how other human beings treat them. So I wanted to start this by saying Tonsitiliantu, right? We are all people. If we could all approach the world with that idea, the world would be a different place. So these are just some images from the camp. On the bottom right is Divine Irakoze. She's the daughter of Catherine, and she's the same age as my daughter. She's 21, my daughter's 20. And it was really striking to me. My daughter's in college, is doing study abroad, and Divine is incredibly bright and smart and trying to figure out what to do as a refugee who can't work legally in the country, whose educational opportunities are really low. She technically is not supposed to leave the camp. So she's got a diploma in social work. She has a job that she gets paid almost nothing for because you can't work as a refugee. I won't tell you the whole story, but it's a little heartbreaking. Here are some images of the camp. Notice it's houses and not tents. These people live here for decades. So it's a community. You see markets, you see pastry shop, place to get cell phone credit, various organizations, bicycles. And so my focus was on this festival that was started originally by a Congolese musician and spoken word artist, Tresor Mpauni. He goes by Menes La Plume. And it happens every year. It's a 4-day festival. Thousands of people, hundreds of people perform, thousands of people come to it. It's all organized by volunteers. Residents, I'm going to use the word residents of the camp. They are refugees, but we'll call them residents of the camp. Young people, this young woman, Angela, is the president of the team of youth volunteers that do a lot of the work of the camp. She's shorter than I am. She's tiny. She's probably 20. She's a powerhouse. I call her Madame President. And so the festival features drama, music, dance, art, and one of the reasons for this festival is to bring Malawians into the camp so that they come what Tresor has done is he's made friends with all the most famous Malawian musicians, and he gets them, the popular famous musicians, come and perform at the festival for free. So Malawians are like, whoa, I want to go to this festival and see my favorite musicians, and it's free. So they come to the camp, and lo and behold, once they're in the camp, they get to see how people live in the camp. They interact with residents of the camp. they buy goods from them, they interact artistically. So it's absolutely genius because, you know, you can get people like, oh, come and take a tour of the camp. That's not going to happen. But they also come and they have a really good time, right? So if they have these ideas of refugees, now they're interacting with other people they're dancing with and they're eating yummy food with, and they're, you know, so it's a very different kinds of interaction. So I've been doing interviewing artists who participate in the festival, trying to get a sense of what it means for them. And so that's one of the chapters of the book, but it's also expanding into a much larger project. And then this project is, here are some of the artists that I met, and they happen to be from the Congo, from the same region of the Congo where I was a child. And the music from the Congo is amazing. And just being in the camp and listening to them perform was just really mind-blowing to me. And it's very sad that they're here, but they're also, you know, they're also just these amazing artists and human beings. So that was really neat. So this project is meant to be very collaborative. It's meant to humanize people who have been displaced. I'm trying to use my position. All of this work that I've done over the years means that I can, you know, do things to publish books or do things to create public materials to bring visibility to the artists. A lot of them want to be successful artists or be known as artists. So I can use some of my resources to help make some of their work more visible. And I'm also in my project just trying to advocate for human rights and social justice. The project is global. So I was just in Turkey. I'm also, I'm in the process of trying to find where to land in terms of the focus in Turkey. There's so much going on. People in Turkey who are displaced people or migrants are doing incredible amounts of art, incredible amounts of organizing, lots of different projects going on. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And some of you in this room have been helping me, and I appreciate that. And then trying to figure out what I'm going to focus on in terms of the book. I'm also working with Uyghur poets in Paris who are involved in the Language and Cultural Conservation Institute, which also ties with my intangible cultural heritage conservation interests, as well as the arts. So they're going to be a chapter. I'm going to go in May for a festival that they're organizing. And then once I kind of get a handle on these 3 countries, which is way more than I can handle right now, but I'm trying to do it. I will add some other countries, and I will do something, 1 or more things in the US as well, but I'm kind of waiting to come back to work in the US once I see what I'm going to do in other parts of the world. So that's my attempt to tell you about, what was it, performance studies, academic and public technologies, socially engaged work. I think that's it. So thank you, Teşekkürler. I don't know how we are doing for time, but I'm available if you have questions or comments.